In my early 20s, with just a rucksack on my back and a large curled up yellow tent tied onto it, I spent 2 back-to-back summers walking up and down the rural parts of western Sweden, close to the Norwegian border. For a large part of it, I kept on to this thing called Sverigeleden, which is a set of dozen of connected roads across all of Sweden meant to form a sort of bicycling network that you can get onto anywhere in the country, and essentially bike from one part of it to the other. Although not necessarily built with walking in mind, it made do for the most part well enough for this purpose. I was happy that it mostly avoided large highways and kept me on small single-file car roads. I think something I was left with after those 2 summers was a new understanding of space, a new approximation of real distance, human distances, how far things are between one another, and the actual speed and slowness it takes to get from one place to the next. Particularly things like population centers like towns and villages, passing mostly uninhabited seas of grass and endless forests, as well as acres and acres of yellow farmland. You quickly learn just how far apart these things really are. Some days I'd walk all day just to get from one village to the next. You had to get used to the fact that you were getting nowhere quickly. For me, the way I relate and think about books and media more generally has always been on a personal level first, before a more formalist one. I want this channel to be a space where I can talk about books I've read in a free format, more essayistic, how I relate to it emotionally and intellectually. This is why I started this video with a short anecdote. I want this channel to be a place where I can talk about books but leave the realm of reviewing and a buy or not buy relationship. Instead, I want to talk about ideas and emotions in a sort of non-linear way. John Steinbeck's 1939 novel Grapes of Wrath is about a lot of things. In a macro sense, the novel is concerned with the Dust Bowl and its political effects on that specific point in American history. It discusses the fallout from that event, like mass labor immigration, rampant violation of human rights, the abuse of power from both companies and government, among other things. On the micro scale, regarding the novel's actual narrative, Steinbeck's book is concerned with the lives of the Oklahoma family of the Jodes, as they pack everything and their whole family into a van, leaving their agrarian life behind in search for the promise of opportunity in the lands to the west, in California. Behind them they leave what can only be described as a landscape not really akin to one we would think of in our own world, but rather one belonging to the post-apocalyptic landscapes of fiction. The Oklahoma that is described in the initial chapters of the book is a desolate land, filled with dust storms and derelict houses. In this place, human life is so sparsely dispersed that the encountering of one another almost at first demands distrust and a preparedness for hostility. This is a description of a real place, but for a modern reader like myself, it makes me think of a visual lineage similar to things like the Fallout series, Mad Max, or The Walking Dead. It was with this similar iconography that initially piqued my interest in the novel. I gasped at the sheer material reality these people must have gone through, experiencing an event that caused the very land around them to warp into something that my mind could only relegate to the landscapes of fantasy, rather than anything real. But what really stuck with me, after that initial curiosity, and what kept me thinking long after I finished the book, is the novel's relationship with space. What occupies those lengths of vacancy in between things, and the endless stretch of time it takes to bridge those two gaps. For most people, the true meaning of time and distance really only starts to hit you once you leave your teenage years behind and enter into early adulthood, when you leave the comfort of your parents' home, when you finish grade school and start working to pay your bills or start attending university. Last summer I was working at a retirement home providing palliative care to elderly folks with dementia. The place I was working at was just about a 20-minute drive outside of the city I live in. The thing is, I don't have a car, and biking there would take me about an hour and a half. Maybe I could have made the stretch a lot faster if I was a more proficient biker, but I don't tend to bike in my day-to-day. Instead, I prefer to just walk everywhere. Maybe this is because I first learned how to ride a bike when I was already in my 20s, so bicycling doesn't come to me as second nature like it does with most folks I know. So I bought myself a public transportation ticket that'll last me for the summer that my municipality provides, and started taking the train there every day. Thing is, I'd first have to take a bus from where I live on the outskirts of my city into the city center, where only there, after waiting for about half an hour, I could take another bus that would take me to my destination a half hour before I started. It was either that or take the next bus, which would mean I would be half an hour late. I started at 7 in the morning, and even though the travel time in both buses added together made up to barely 30 minutes, due to how early I had to start traveling and the lack of separate bus options, I'd have to get up at around 4:30 in the morning just to get to work. No matter how I cut it, whether by bicycling or taking public transport, I'd have to shave off multiple hours from my day just waiting. Dead time. For a lot of us, distance and its relation to time becomes this ultra-antagonistic presence in our lives, when we are constantly negotiating terms of engagement with just so that we can leave the battlefield every day with the least amount of scarring. For the Jodes, traveling and making these choices, compromise is always at the forefront. How can we lessen the amount of hurt we are putting ourselves through just to get from one part of the country to another, by whatever meager means they have available to them? Packed like sardines in that simple vehicle, they are forced to make concession after concession, sacrifice after sacrifice, just to stay alive, to keep on moving. The family as a whole begins to slowly hollow out from the inside. Their tight-knit unit begins to decay like the bark of a tree slowly peeling away to reveal an empty inside. One by one, family members or newfound kinship bonds they form with folk on the road vanish from the group, either through death or abandonment. But in order to survive, the rest must keep going. No time is left to mourn, only to go forward and to have regret fuel your journey onwards. I've had plenty of low-paying jobs in the past. Each in itself is hollowing. But working in that elderly home that summer was the first time so much of my free time would just vanish on account of having to spend it traveling. Distances that weren't even far away per se, but were made far on account of my own meager means in which to resolve those distances. This frustration, having to sacrifice so much for a simple commute, is something a lot of people have experience with. The sad thing is that what happened to me is relatively common. I don't even need to quote some study to back this up. I could just use my own two eyes. It was easy to count all those poor souls barely woken up next to me in the station at 5 a.m. Tom Joad, the younger, essentially works as a stand-in for the exploited worker, an everyman of sorts. Someone who at the beginning of the book has no way of vocalizing what it is that's wrong with the world, but who by the end of it comes to a sort of enlightenment after the lengths he's gone through to survive on his travels, and at the realization of the toll it all took on him and his loved ones, the lives it's taken, violently, whether explicitly, like with the actual murder of his friend Casey the preacher by scabs, or implicitly, through the displacement of his family and the lives that the journey claimed, the stress and trauma being forcefully uprooted from your home that can actually lead to death or insanity in some, as personified by his grandparents or his brother Noah. There's an anger in the text that is prevalent throughout the novel. Steinbeck's own political leanings were, to my understanding, complex and not always consistent. But it is evident in The Grapes of Wrath that the novel flirts with many socialist ideas, and it is clear that whether or not Steinbeck himself was fully sympathetic to socialism, it seems to me that what his characters crave is simply to be treated as human beings, and to earn their own keep while holding onto a modicum of their own self-worth, their heads held high. To me, the intent I find in the text is obvious. An authorial intent aside, it is not relevant for my understanding of the text or what I take from it. However, it seems clear to me that the rage that fills the entirety of the work has one way or another been manifested in an idea that its characters can only come to build an egalitarian world through one form of collective action or another, whether that be represented in the way the government camp is driven, with its rotating chairpersons' seats and direct democratic measures of those living there, or represented in the workers outside of the cotton farms forming a union led by the preacher and going on strike. It is clear that the novel is saying that the only path for equal power for all of us being exploited is through collective action, and the only way to live decently, as should behoove a human being, is by creating those conditions together, collectively, as a community of laborers. Just this past year in north Sweden, some men died whilst working for the company known as Northvolt. Young men with seemingly no reason to be sick who just spontaneously died, and Northvolt refuses to comment, claiming that there was no malpractice. To be honest, I think it's evident to everyone taking a second to think what really happened. It's what always happens in places where faceless organizations can exploit us and what has been going on for hundreds of years. This book has got me thinking about collective action. It's got me thinking about the great distances we travel in order to survive, and the lengths we can and will go to protect and feed the ones we love, and that those we can love don't need to be your blood relatives, but really anyone who can give another human being decency and pay that decency in kind can be of a, what Tom Joad the elderly says of the Wilkinsons, kin relationship. In the final scene of Grapes of Wrath, Rosa Sharn, a character who has dreamt of escaping the shackles of her class position and traveling upwards, feeds a starving old man in a barn with a milk from her breast meant for her baby that died during childbirth. She cracks a smile during this, and that is the last image the book leaves us with. And I think for me, I very much subscribe to the particular popular analysis of the scene that claims that the reason she is smiling is because she is doing her part as a member of a larger family, acting in solidarity with all those exploited masses that she now accepts herself as a part of. Like Rosa Sharn, we're all inherently part of this larger network. It is opaque systems and enigmatic structures of power that tear at these latent links to one another that we should otherwise have so naturally.